Chapter 12 of An Anonymous Story by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 12. With my head wet from the snow and gasping for breath, I ran to my room and immediately flung off my swallow tails, put on a reefer jacket and an overcoat, and carried my portmanteau out into the passage. I must get away. But before going I hurriedly sat down and began writing to Orlov. "I leave you my false passport," I began. "I beg you to keep it as a memento, you false man, you Petersburg official. To steal into another man's house under a false name, to watch under the mask of a flunkey this person's intimate life, to hear everything, to see everything in order later on, unasked, to accuse a man of lying all this, you will say, is on a level with theft. Yes, but I care nothing for fine feelings now. I have endured dozens of your dinners and suppers when you said and did what you liked, and I had to hear, to look on, and be silent. I don't want to make you a present of my silence. Besides, if there is not a living soul at hand who dares to tell you the truth without flattery, let your flunkey Stepan wash your magnificent countenance for you." I did not like this beginning, but I did not care to alter it. Besides, what did it matter? The big windows with their dark curtains, the bed, the crumpled dress coat on the floor, and my wet footprints looked gloomy and forbidding, and there was a peculiar stillness. Possibly because I had run out into the street without my cap and goloshes, I was in a high fever. My face burned, my legs ached, my heavy head drooped over the table, and there was that kind of division in my thought when every idea in the brain seemed dogged by its shadow. "I am ill, weak, morally cast down," I went on. "I cannot write to you as I should like to. From the first moment I desired to insult and humiliate you, but now I do not feel that I have the right to do so. You and I have both fallen, and neither of us will ever rise up again. And even if my letter were eloquent, terrible, and passionate, it would still seem like beating on the lid of a coffin. However one knocks upon it, one will not wake up the dead. No efforts could warm your accursed cold blood, and you know that better than I do. Why write? But my mind and heart are burning, and I go on writing. For some reason I am moved as though this letter still might save you and me. I am so feverish that my thoughts are disconnected, and my pen scratches the paper without meaning. But the question I want to put to you stands before me as clear as though in letters of flame. Why I am prematurely weak and fallen is not hard to explain. Like Samson of old, I have taken the gates of Gaza on my shoulders to carry them to the top of the mountain. And only when I was exhausted, when youth and health were quenched in me forever, I noticed that that burden was not for my shoulders, and that I had deceived myself. I have been, moreover, in cruel and continual pain. I have endured cold, hunger, illness, and loss of liberty. Of personal happiness I know and have known nothing. I have no home, my memories are bitter, and my conscience is often in dread of them. But why have you fallen? You? What fatal, diabolical causes hindered your life from blossoming into full flower? Why, almost before beginning life, were you in such haste to cast off the image and likeness of God, and to become a cowardly beast who backs and scares others because he is afraid himself? You are afraid of life, as afraid of it as an Oriental who sits all day on a cushion smoking his hookah. Yes, you read a great deal, and a European coat fits you well, but yet with what tender, purely Oriental, pasha-like care you protect yourself from hunger, cold, physical effort, from pain and uneasiness. How early your soul has taken to its dressing gown! What a cowardly part you have played towards real life and nature, with which every healthy and normal man struggles! How soft, how snug, how warm, how comfortable, and how bored you are! Yes, it is deathly boredom, unrelieved by one ray of light, as in solitary confinement. But you try to hide from that enemy too. You play cards 8 hours out of 24. And your irony? Oh, but how well I understand it! Free, bold, living thought is searching and dominating. For an indolent, sluggish mind it is intolerable. That it may not disturb your peace, like thousands of your contemporaries, you make haste in youth to put it under bar and bolt. Your ironical attitude to life, or whatever you like to call it, is your armour. And your thought, fettered and frightened, dare not leap over the fence you have put round it. And when you jeer at ideas which you pretend to know all about, you are like the deserter fleeing from the field of battle, and to stifle his shame, sneering at war and at valour. Cynicism stifles pain. In some novel of Dostoevsky's an old man tramples underfoot the portrait of his dearly loved daughter because he had been unjust to her, and you vent your foul and vulgar jeers upon the ideas of goodness and truth because you have not the strength to follow them. You are frightened of every honest and truthful hint at your degradation, and you purposely surround yourself with people who do nothing but flatter your weaknesses. And you may well dread the sight of tears. By the way, your attitude to women. Shamelessness has been handed down to us in our flesh and blood, and we are trained to shamelessness, but that is what we are men for, to subdue the beast in us. When you reached manhood and all ideas became known to you, you could not have failed to see the truth. You knew it, but you did not follow it. You were afraid of it, and to deceive your conscience, you began loudly assuring yourself that it was not you, but woman that was to blame, that she was as degraded as your attitude to her. Your cold, scabrous anecdotes, your coarse laughter, all your innumerable theories concerning the underlying reality of marriage and the definite demands made upon it, concerning the 10 sous the French workman pays his woman, your everlasting attacks on female logic, lying, weakness, and so on, doesn't it all look like a desire at all costs to force woman down into the mud that she may be on the same level as your attitude to her? You are a weak, unhappy, unpleasant person. Zinaida Fyodorovna began playing the piano in the drawing room, trying to recall the song of Saint Saens that Gruzin had played. I went and lay on my bed, but remembering that it was time for me to go, I got up with an effort, and with a heavy, burning head went to the table again. "But this is the question," I went on. "Why are we worn out? Why are we at first so passionate, so bold, so noble, and so full of faith, complete bankrupts at 30 or 35? Why does one waste in consumption, another put a bullet through his brains, a third seeks forgetfulness in vodka and cards, while the fourth tries to stifle his fear and misery by cynically trampling underfoot the pure image of his fair youth? Why is it that, having once fallen, we do not try to rise up again, and, losing one thing, do not seek something else? Why is it? The thief hanging on the cross could bring back the joy of life and the courage of confident hope, though perhaps he had not more than an hour to live. You have long years before you, and I shall probably not die so soon as one might suppose. What if by a miracle the present turned out to be a dream, a horrible nightmare, and we should wake up renewed, pure, strong, proud of our righteousness? Sweet visions fire me, and I am almost breathless with emotion. I have a terrible longing to live. I long for our life to be holy, lofty, and majestic as the heavens above. Let us live. The sun doesn't rise twice a day, and life is not given us again. Clutch at what is left of your life and save it. I did not write another word. I had a multitude of thoughts in my mind, but I could not connect them and get them onto paper. Without finishing the letter, I signed it with my name and rank and went into the study. It was dark. I felt for the table and put the letter on it. I must have stumbled against the furniture in the dark and made a noise. "Who is there?" I heard an alarmed voice in the drawing room, and the clock on the table softly struck 1 at the moment. End of chapter 12. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 13 of an anonymous story by Anton Chekhov. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 13. For at least half a minute I fumbled at the door in the dark, feeling for the handle. Then I slowly opened it and walked into the drawing room. Zinaida Fyodorovna was lying on the couch, and raising herself on her elbow, she looked towards me. Unable to bring myself to speak, I walked slowly by, and she followed me with her eyes. I stood for a little time in the dining room, and then walked by her again, and she looked at me intently and with perplexity, even with alarm. At last I stood still and said with an effort, "He is not coming back." She quickly got on to her feet and looked at me without understanding. "He is not coming back," I repeated, and my heart beat violently. "He will not come back, for he has not left Petersburg. He is staying at Pekarsky's." She understood and believed me. I saw that from her sudden pallor and from the way she laid her arms upon her bosom in terror and entreaty. In one instant all that had happened of late flashed through her mind. She reflected, and with pitiless clarity she saw the whole truth. But at the same time she remembered that I was a flunkey, a being of a lower order. A casual stranger with hair ruffled, with face flushed with fever, perhaps drunk, in a common overcoat, was coarsely intruding into her intimate life, and that offended her. She said to me sternly: "It's not your business. Go away." "Oh, believe me," I cried impetuously, holding out my hands to her. "I am not a footman. I am as free as you." I mentioned my name, and, speaking very rapidly that she might not interrupt me or go away, explained to her who I was and why I was living there. This new discovery struck her more than the first. Till then she had hoped that her footman had lied, or made a mistake, or been silly; but now, after my confession, she had no doubts left. From the expression of her unhappy eyes and face, which suddenly lost its softness and beauty and looked old, I saw that she was insufferably miserable, and that the conversation would lead to no good. But I went on impetuously. "The senator and the tour of inspection were invented to deceive you. In January, just as now, he did not go away, but stayed at Pekarsky's, and I saw him every day and took part in the deception. He was weary of you, he hated your presence here, he mocked at you. If you could have heard how he and his friends here jeered at you and your love, you would not have remained here 1 minute. Go away from here, go away." "Well," she said in a shaking voice, and moved her hand over her hair. "Well, so be it." Her eyes were full of tears, her lips were quivering, and her whole face was strikingly pale and distorted with anger. Orlov's coarse, petty lying revolted her and seemed to her contemptible, ridiculous. She smiled, and I did not like that smile. "Well," she repeated, passing her hand over her hair again, "so be it. He imagines that I shall die of humiliation, and instead of that I am amused by it. There's no need for him to hide." She walked away from the piano and said, shrugging her shoulders: "There's no need. It would have been simpler to have it out with me, instead of keeping in hiding in other people's flats. I have eyes. I saw it myself long ago. I was only waiting for him to come back to have things out once for all." Then she sat down on a low chair by the table, and, leaning her head on the arm of the sofa, wept bitterly. In the drawing room there was only one candle burning in the candelabra, and the chair where she was sitting was in darkness, but I saw how her head and shoulders were quivering, and how her hair, escaping from her combs, covered her neck, her face, her arms. Her quiet, steady weeping, which was not hysterical, but a woman's ordinary weeping, expressed a sense of insult, of wounded pride, of injury, and of something helpless, hopeless, which one could not set right and to which one could not get used. Her tears stirred an echo in my troubled and suffering heart. I forgot my illness and everything else in the world. I walked about the drawing room and muttered distractedly: "Is this life? Oh, one can't go on living like this, one can't. Oh, it's madness, wickedness, not life." "What humiliation!" she said through her tears. "To live together, to smile at me at the very time when I was burdensome to him, ridiculous in his eyes. Oh, how humiliating!" She lifted up her head, and looking at me with tear-stained eyes through her hair, wet with her tears, and pushing it back as it prevented her seeing me, she asked: "They laughed at me?" "To these men you were laughable, you and your love and Turgenev. They said your head was full of him. And if we both die at once in despair, that will amuse them too. They will make a funny anecdote of it and tell it at your requiem service. But why talk of them?" I said impatiently. "We must get away from here. I cannot stay here 1 minute longer." She began crying again, while I walked to the piano and sat down. "What are we waiting for?" I asked dejectedly. "It's 2 o'clock." "I am not waiting for anything," she said. "I am utterly lost." "Why do you talk like that? We had better consider together what we are to do. Neither you nor I can stay here. Where do you intend to go?" Suddenly there was a ring at the bell. My heart stood still. Could it be Orlov? to whom perhaps Kukushkin had complained of me? How should we meet? I went to open the door. It was Polya. She came in shaking the snow off her pelisse, and went into her room without saying a word to me. When I went back to the drawing room, Zinaida Fyodorovna, pale as death, was standing in the middle of the room, looking towards me with big eyes. "Who was it?" she asked softly. "Polya," I answered. She passed her hand over her hair and closed her eyes wearily. "I will go away at once," she said. "Will you be kind and take me to the Petersburg side? What time is it now?" "3:15." End of chapter 13. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 14 of an anonymous story by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 14. When, a little afterwards, we went out of the house, it was dark and deserted in the street. Wet snow was falling, and a damp wind lashed in one's face. I remember it was the beginning of March. A thaw had set in, and for some days past the cabman had been driving on wheels. Under the impression of the back stairs, of the cold, of the midnight darkness, and the porter in his sheepskin who had questioned us before letting us out of the gate, Zinaida Fyodorovna was utterly cast down and dispirited. When we got into the cab and the hood was put up, trembling all over, she began hurriedly saying how grateful she was to me. "I do not doubt your good will, but I am ashamed that you should be troubled," she muttered. "Oh, I understand, I understand. When Gruzin was here to day, I felt that he was lying and concealing something. Well, so be it, but I am ashamed anyway that you should be troubled." She still had her doubts. To dispel them finally, I asked the cabman to drive through Sergievsky Street. Stopping him at Pekarsky's door, I got out of the cab and rang. When the porter came to the door, I asked aloud, that Zinaida Fyodorovna might hear, whether Georgy Ivanitch was at home. "Yes," was the answer. "He came in half an hour ago. He must be in bed by now. What do you want?" Zinaida Fyodorovna could not refrain from putting her head out. "Has Georgy Ivanitch been staying here long?" she asked. "Going on for 3 weeks." "And he's not been away?" "No," answered the porter, looking at me with surprise. "Tell him early to morrow," I said, "that his sister has arrived from Warsaw. Good bye." Then we drove on. The cab had no apron, the snow fell on us in big flakes, and the wind, especially on the Neva, pierced us through and through. I began to feel as though we had been driving for a long time, that for ages we had been suffering, and that for ages I had been listening to Zinaida Fyodorovna's shuddering breath. In semi-delirium, as though half asleep, I looked back upon my strange, incoherent life, and for some reason recalled a melodrama, The Parisian Beggars, which I had seen once or twice in my childhood. And when, to shake off that semi-delirium, I peeped out from the hood and saw the dawn, all the images of the past, all my misty thoughts, for some reason blended in me into one distinct, overpowering thought. Everything was irrevocably over for Zinaida Fyodorovna and for me. This was as certain a conviction as though the cold blue sky contained a prophecy. But a minute later I was already thinking of something else, and believed differently. "What am I now?" said Zinaida Fyodorovna, in a voice husky with the cold and the damp. "Where am I to go? What am I to do? Gruzin told me to go into a nunnery. Oh, I would! I would change my dress, my face, my name, my thoughts, everything, everything, and would hide myself forever. But they will not take me into a nunnery. I am with child." "We will go abroad together to morrow," I said. "That's impossible. My husband won't give me a passport." "I will take you without a passport." The cabman stopped at a wooden house of 2 storeys, painted a dark colour. I rang. Taking from me her small light basket, the only luggage we had brought with us, Zinaida Fyodorovna gave a wry smile and said, "These are my bijoux." But she was so weak that she could not carry these bijoux. It was a long while before the door was opened. After the 3rd or 4th ring a light gleamed in the windows, and there was a sound of steps, coughing and whispering. At last the key grated in the lock, and a stout peasant woman with a frightened red face appeared at the door. Some distance behind her stood a thin little old woman with short grey hair, carrying a candle in her hand. Zinaida Fyodorovna ran into the passage and flung her arms round the old woman's neck. "Nina, I've been deceived," she sobbed loudly. "I've been coarsely, foully deceived. Nina, Nina!" I handed the basket to the peasant woman. The door was closed, but still I heard her sobs and the cry "Nina." I got into the cab and told the man to drive slowly to the Nevsky Prospect. I had to think of a night's lodging for myself. Next day towards evening I went to see Zinaida Fyodorovna. She was terribly changed. There were no traces of tears on her pale, terribly sunken face, and her expression was different. I don't know whether it was that I saw her now in different surroundings, far from luxurious, and that our relations were by now different, or perhaps that intense grief had already set its mark upon her. She did not strike me as so elegant and well dressed as before. Her figure seemed smaller; there was an abruptness and excessive nervousness about her, as though she were in a hurry, and there was not the same softness even in her smile. I was dressed in an expensive suit which I had bought during the day. She looked first of all at that suit and at the hat in my hand, then turned an impatient, searching glance upon my face as though studying it. "Your transformation still seems to me a sort of miracle," she said. "Forgive me for looking at you with such curiosity. You are an extraordinary man, you know." I told her again who I was and why I was living at Orlov's, and I told her at greater length and in more detail than the day before. She listened with great attention, and said without letting me finish: "Everything there is over for me. You know I could not refrain from writing a letter. Here is the answer." On the sheet which she gave there was written in Orlov's hand: "I am not going to justify myself, but you must own that it was your mistake, not mine. I wish you happiness and beg you to make haste and forget. Yours sincerely, G.O. P.S. I am sending on your things." The trunks and baskets dispatched by Orlov were standing in the passage, and my poor little portmanteau was there beside them. "So," Zinaida Fyodorovna began, but she did not finish. We were silent. She took the note and held it for a couple of minutes before her eyes, and during that time her face wore the same haughty, contemptuous, proud, and harsh expression as the day before at the beginning of our explanation. Tears came into her eyes, not timid, bitter tears, but proud, angry tears. "Listen," she said, getting up abruptly and moving away to the window that I might not see her face. "I have made up my mind to go abroad with you to morrow." "I am very glad. I am ready to go to day." "Accept me as a recruit. Have you read Balzac?" she asked suddenly, turning round. "Have you? At the end of his novel Pere Goriot the hero looks down upon Paris from the top of a hill and threatens the town. 'Now we shall settle our account.' And after this he begins a new life. So when I look out of the train window at Petersburg for the last time, I shall say, 'Now we shall settle our account.'" Saying this, she smiled at her jest, and for some reason shuddered all over. End of chapter 14. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 15 of an anonymous story by Anton Chekhov, translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 15. At Venice I had an attack of pleurisy. Probably I had caught cold in the evening when we were rowing from the station to the Hotel Bauer. I had to take to my bed and stay there for a fortnight. Every morning while I was ill, Zinaida Fyodorovna came from her room to drink coffee with me, and afterwards read aloud to me French and Russian books, of which we had bought a number at Vienna. These books were either long familiar to me, or else had no interest for me, but I had the sound of a sweet, kind voice beside me, so that the meaning of all of them was summed up for me in the one thing: I was not alone. She would go out for a walk, come back in her light grey dress, her light straw hat, gay, warmed by the spring sun, and sitting by my bed, bending low down over me, would tell me something about Venice or read me those books, and I was happy. At night I was cold, ill, and dreary, but by day I revelled in life. I can find no better expression for it. The brilliant warm sunshine beating in at the open windows and at the door upon the balcony, the shouts below, the splash of oars, the tinkle of bells, the prolonged boom of the cannon at midday, and the feeling of perfect, perfect freedom did wonders with me. I felt as though I were growing strong, broad wings, which were bearing me God knows whither. And what charm, what joy at times at the thought that another life was so close to mine, that I was the servant, the guardian, the friend, the indispensable fellow traveller of a creature, young, beautiful, wealthy, but weak, lonely, and insulted. It is pleasant even to be ill when you know that there are people who are looking forward to your convalescence as to a holiday. One day I heard her whispering behind the door with my doctor, and then she came in to me with tear-stained eyes. It was a bad sign, but I was touched, and there was a wonderful lightness in my heart. But at last they allowed me to go out on the balcony. The sunshine and the breeze from the sea caressed and fondled my sick body. I looked down at the familiar gondolas, which glide with feminine grace smoothly and majestically as though they were alive, and felt all the luxury of this original, fascinating civilization. There was a smell of the sea. Some one was playing a stringed instrument, and two voices were singing. How delightful it was! How unlike it was to that Petersburg night when the wet snow was falling and beating so rudely on our faces. If one looks straight across the canal one sees the sea, and on the wide expanse towards the horizon the sun glittered on the water so dazzlingly that it hurt one's eyes to look at it. My soul yearned towards that lovely sea, which was so akin to me, and to which I had given up my youth. I longed to live, and nothing more. A fortnight later I began walking freely. I loved to sit in the sun and to listen to the gondoliers without understanding them, and for hours together to gaze at the little house where, they said, Desdemona lived. A naïve, mournful little house with a demure expression, as light as lace, so light that it looked as though one could lift it from its place with one hand. I stood for a long time by the tomb of Canova, and could not take my eyes off the melancholy lion. And in the Palace of the Doges I was always drawn to the corner where the portrait of the unhappy Marino Faliero was painted over with black. It is fine to be an artist, a poet, a dramatist, I thought, but since that is not vouchsafed to me, if only I could go in for mysticism, if only I had a grain of some faith to add to the unruffled peace and serenity that fills the soul. In the evening we ate oysters, drank wine, and went out in a gondola. I remember our black gondola swayed softly in the same place, while the water faintly gurgled under it. Here and there the reflection of the stars and the lights on the bank quivered and trembled. Not far from us in a gondola, hung with coloured lanterns, which were reflected in the water, there were people singing. The sounds of guitars, of violins, of mandolins, of men's and women's voices were audible in the dark. Zinaida Fyodorovna, pale, with a grave, almost stern face, was sitting beside me, compressing her lips and clenching her hands. She was thinking about something. She did not stir an eyelash nor hear me. Her face, her attitude, and her fixed, expressionless gaze, and her incredibly miserable, dreadful, and icy cold memories, and around her the gondolas, the lights, the music, the song with its vigorous, passionate cry of "Jammo! Jammo!" What contrasts in life! When she sat like that, with tightly clasped hands, stony, mournful, I used to feel as though we were both characters in some novel in the old fashioned style called "The Ill Fated," "The Abandoned," or something of the sort. Both of us, she the ill fated, the abandoned, and I the faithful, devoted friend, the dreamer, and, if you like it, a superfluous man, a failure capable of nothing but coughing and dreaming and perhaps sacrificing myself. But who and what needed my sacrifices now? And what had I to sacrifice indeed? When we came in the evening we always drank tea in her room and talked. We did not shrink from touching on old unhealed wounds. On the contrary, for some reason I felt a positive pleasure in telling her about my life at Orlov's, or referring openly to relations which I knew and which could not have been concealed from me. "At moments I hated you," I said to her. "When he was capricious, condescending, told you lies,
I marvelled how it was you did not see, did not understand, when it was all so clear. You kissed his hands, you knelt to him, you flattered him." "When I kissed his hands and knelt to him, I loved him," she said, blushing crimson. "Can it have been so difficult to see through him? A fine sphinx! A sphinx indeed! A Kammer Junker! I reproach you for nothing, God forbid," I went on, feeling I was coarse, that I had not the tact, the delicacy, which are so essential when you have to do with a fellow creature's soul. In early days before I knew her I had not noticed this defect in myself. "But how could you fail to see what he was?" I went on, speaking more softly, and more diffidently, however. "You mean to say you despise my past, and you are right," she said, deeply stirred. "You belong to a special class of men who cannot be judged by ordinary standards. Your moral requirements are exceptionally rigorous, and I understand you can't forgive things. I understand you. And if sometimes I say the opposite, it doesn't mean that I look at things differently from you. I speak the same old nonsense simply because I haven't had time yet to wear out my old clothes and prejudices. I, too, hate and despise my past, and Orlov and my love. What was that love? It's positively absurd now," she said, going to the window and looking down at the canal. "All this love only clouds the conscience and confuses the mind. The meaning of life is to be found only in one thing fighting. To get one's heel on the vile head of the serpent and to crush it that's the meaning of life. In that alone, or in nothing." I told her long stories of my past, and described my really astounding adventures. But of the change that had taken place in me I did not say one word. She always listened to me with great attention, and at interesting places she rubbed her hands, as though vexed that it had not been her lot yet to experience such adventures, such joys and terrors. Then she would suddenly fall to musing and retreat into herself, and I could see from her face that she was not attending to me. I closed the windows that looked out on the canal, and asked whether we should not have the fire lighted. "No, never mind, I am not cold," she said, smiling listlessly. "I only feel weak."
Do you know, I fancy I have grown much wiser lately. I have extraordinary original ideas now. When I think of my past, of my life then, people in general, in fact, it is all summed up for me in the image of my stepmother: coarse, insolent, soulless, false, depraved, and a morphiamaniac too. My father, who was feeble and weak-willed, married my mother for her money and drove her into consumption. But his second wife, my stepmother, he loved passionately, insanely. What I had to put up with! But what is the use of talking? And so, as I say, it is all summed up in her image. And it vexes me that my stepmother is dead. I should like to meet her now." "Why?" "I don't know," she answered with a laugh and a graceful movement of her head. "Good night. You must get well. As soon as you are well we'll take up our work. It's time to begin." After I had said good night and had my hand on the door handle, she said, "What do you think? Is Polya still living there?" "Probably." And I went off to my room. So we spent a whole month. One grey morning, when we both stood at my window, looking at the clouds which were moving up from the sea, and at the darkening canal, expecting every minute that it would pour with rain, and when a thick, narrow streak of rain covered the sea as though with a muslin veil, we both felt suddenly dreary. The same day we both set off for Florence. End of chapter 15. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 16 of an anonymous story by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 16. It was autumn at Nice. One morning when I went into her room she was sitting on a low chair, bent together and huddled up, with her legs crossed and her face hidden in her hands. She was weeping bitterly, with sobs, and her long unbrushed hair fell on her knees. The impression of the exquisite, marvellous sea which I had only just seen, and of which I wanted to tell her, left me all at once, and my heart ached. "What is it?" I asked. She took one hand from her face and motioned me to go away. "What is it?" I repeated, and for the first time during our acquaintance I kissed her hand. "No, it's nothing, nothing," she said quickly. "Oh, it's nothing, nothing. Go away. You see I am not dressed." I went out overwhelmed. The calm and serene mood in which I had been for so long was poisoned by compassion. I had a passionate longing to fall at her feet, to entreat her not to weep in solitude, but to share her grief with me, and the monotonous murmur of the sea already sounded a gloomy prophecy in my ears, and I foresaw fresh tears, fresh troubles, and fresh losses in the future. What is she crying about? What is it, I wondered, recalling her face and her agonized look. I remembered she was with child. She tried to conceal her condition from other people, and also from herself. At home she went about in a loose wrapper, or in a blouse with extremely full folds over the bosom, and when she went out anywhere she laced herself in so tightly that on 2 occasions she fainted when we were out. She never spoke to me of her condition, and when I hinted that it might be as well to see a doctor, she flushed crimson and said not a word. When I went to see her next time she was already dressed and had her hair done. "There, there," I said, seeing that she was ready to cry again. "We had better go to the sea and have a talk." "I can't talk. Forgive me, I am in the mood now when one wants to be alone. And if you please, Vladimir Ivanitch, another time you want to come into my room, be so good as to give a knock at the door." That "be so good" had a peculiar, unfeminine sound. I went away. My accursed Petersburg mood came back, and all my dreams were crushed and crumpled up like leaves by the heat. I felt I was alone again, and there was no nearness between us. I was no more to her than that cobweb to that palm tree, which hangs on it by chance and which will be torn off and carried away by the wind. I walked about the square where the band was playing, went into the casino. There I looked at overdressed and heavily perfumed women, and every one of them glanced at me as though she would say, "You are alone. That's all right." Then I went out on the terrace and looked for a long time at the sea. There was not one sail on the horizon. On the left bank, in the lilac coloured mist, there were mountains, gardens, towers, and houses. The sun was sparkling over it all, but it was all alien, indifferent, an incomprehensible tangle. End of chapter 16. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 17 of an Anonymous Story by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 17. She used, as before, to come into my room in the morning to coffee, but we no longer dined together, as she said she was not hungry, and she lived only on coffee, tea, and various trifles such as oranges and caramels. And we no longer had conversations in the evening. I don't know why it was like this. Ever since the day when I had found her in tears, she had treated me somehow lightly, at times casually, even ironically, and for some reason called me "my good sir." What had before seemed to her terrible, heroic, marvellous, and had stirred her envy and enthusiasm, did not touch her now at all, and usually after listening to me she stretched and said, "Yes, great things were done in days of yore, my good sir." It sometimes happened even that I did not see her for days together. I would knock timidly and guiltily at her door and get no answer. I would knock again. Still silence. I would stand near the door and listen. Then the chambermaid would pass and say coldly, "Madame est partie." Then I would walk about the passages of the hotel, walk and walk. English people, full bosomed ladies, waiters in swallow tails. And as I keep gazing at the long striped rug that stretches the whole length of the corridor, the idea occurs to me that I am playing in the life of this woman a strange, probably false part, and that it is beyond my power to alter that part. I run to my room and fall on my bed and think, and can come to no conclusion, and all that is clear to me is that I want to live, and that the plainer and the colder and the harder her face grows, the nearer she is to me, and the more intensely and painfully I feel our kinship. Never mind, "my good sir," never mind her light, careless tone, never mind anything you like, only don't leave me, my treasure. I am afraid to be alone. Then I go out into the corridor again, listen in a tremor. I have no dinner. I don't notice the approach of evening. At last, about 11, I hear the familiar footstep, and at the turn near the stairs Zinaida Fyodorovna comes into sight. "Are you taking a walk?" she would ask as she passes me. "You had better go out into the air. Good night." "But shall we not meet again to day?" "I think it's late, but as you like." "Tell me, where have you been?" I would ask, following her into the room. "Where? To Monte Carlo." She took 10 gold coins out of her pocket and said: "Look, my good sir, I have won. That's at roulette." "Oh, nonsense! As though you would gamble." "Why not? I am going again to morrow." I imagined her with a sick and morbid face, in her condition, tightly laced, standing near the gaming table in a crowd of cocottes, of old women in their dotage who swarm round the gold like flies round the honey. I remembered she had gone off to Monte Carlo for some reason, in secret from me. "I don't believe you," I said one day. "You wouldn't go there." "Don't agitate yourself. I can't lose much." "It's not the question of what you lose," I said with annoyance. "Has it never occurred to you, while you were playing there, that the glitter of gold, all these women, young and old, the croupiers, all the surroundings, that it is all a vile, loathsome mockery at the toiler's labour, at his bloody sweat?" "Well, if one doesn't play, what is one to do here?" she asked. "The toiler's labour and his bloody sweat, all that eloquence you can put off till another time. But now, since you have begun, let me go on. Let me ask you bluntly, what is there for me to do here, and what am I to do?" "What are you to do?" I said, shrugging my shoulders. "That's a question that can't be answered straight off." "I beg you to answer me honestly, Vladimir Ivanitch," she said, and her face looked angry. "Once I have brought myself to ask you this question, I am not going to listen to stock phrases. I am asking you," she went on, beating her hand on the table as though marking time, "what ought I to do here? And not only here at Nice, but in general." I did not speak, but looked out of window to the sea. My heart was beating terribly. "Vladimir Ivanitch," she said softly and breathlessly. It was hard for her to speak. "Vladimir Ivanitch, if you do not believe in the cause yourself, if you no longer think of going back to it, why did you drag me out of Petersburg? Why did you make me promises? Why did you rouse mad hopes? Your convictions have changed, you have become a different man, and nobody blames you for it. Our convictions are not always in our power. But Vladimir Ivanitch, for God's sake, why are you not sincere?" she went on softly, coming up to me. "All these months when I have been dreaming aloud, raving, going into raptures over my plans, remodelling my life on a new pattern, why didn't you tell me the truth? Why were you silent, or encouraged me by your stories, and behaved as though you were in complete sympathy with me? Why was it? Why was it necessary?" "It's difficult to acknowledge one's bankruptcy," I said, turning round, but not looking at her. "Yes, I have no faith. I am worn out. I have lost heart. It is difficult to be truthful, very difficult, and I held my tongue. God forbid that any one should have to go through what I have been through." I felt that I was on the point of tears, and ceased speaking. "Vladimir Ivanitch," she said, and took me by both hands, "you have been through so much, and seen so much of life, you know more than I do. Think seriously and tell me, what am I to do? Teach me. If you haven't the strength to go forward yourself, and take others with you, at least show me where to go. After all, I am a living, feeling, thinking being. To sink into a false position, to play an absurd part, is painful to me. I don't reproach you, I don't blame you, I only ask you." Tea was brought in. "Well?" said Zinaida Fyodorovna, giving me a glass. "What do you say to me?" "There is more light in the world than you see through your window," I answered. "And there are other people besides me, Zinaida Fyodorovna." "Then tell me who they are," she said eagerly. "That's all I ask of you." "And I want to say, too," I went on, "one can serve an idea in more than one calling. If one has made a mistake and lost faith in one, one may find another. The world of ideas is large and cannot be exhausted." "The world of ideas?" she said, and she looked into my face sarcastically. "Then we had better leave off talking. What's the use?" She flushed. "The world of ideas!" she repeated. She threw her dinner napkin aside, and an expression of indignation and contempt came into her face. "All your fine ideas, I see, lead up to one inevitable, essential step. I ought to become your mistress. That's what's wanted. To be taken up with ideas without being the mistress of an honourable, progressive man is as good as not understanding the ideas. One has to begin with that is, with being your mistress, and the rest will come of itself." "You are irritated, Zinaida Fyodorovna," I said. "No, I am sincere," she cried, breathing hard. "I am sincere." "You are sincere, perhaps, but you are in error, and it hurts me to hear you." "I am in error!" she laughed. "Any one else might say that, but not you, my dear sir. I may seem to you indelicate, cruel, but I don't care. You love me? You love me, don't you?" I shrugged my shoulders. "Yes, shrug your shoulders," she went on sarcastically. "When you were ill I heard you in your delirium, and ever since these adoring eyes, these sighs and edifying conversations about friendship, about spiritual kinship. But the point is, why haven't you been sincere? Why have you concealed what is and talked about what isn't? Had you said from the beginning what ideas exactly led you to drag me from Petersburg, I should have known. I should have poisoned myself then, as I meant to, and there would have been none of this tedious farce. But what's the use of talking?" With a wave of the hand she sat down. "You speak to me as though you suspected me of dishonourable intentions," I said, offended. "Oh, very well. What's the use of talking? I don't suspect you of intentions, but of having no intentions. If you had any, I should have known them by now. You had nothing but ideas and love. For the present, ideas and love, and in prospect, me as your mistress. That's in the order of things both in life and in novels. Here you abused him," she said, and she slapped the table with her hand, "but one can't help agreeing with him. He has good reasons for despising these ideas." "He does not despise ideas, he is afraid of them," I cried. "He is a coward and a liar." "Oh, very well. He is a coward and a liar, and deceived me. And you? Excuse my frankness. What are you? He deceived me and left me to take my chance in Petersburg, and you have deceived me and abandoned me here. But he did not mix up ideas with his deceit, and you..." "For goodness' sake, why are you saying this?" I cried in horror, wringing my hands and going up to her quickly. "No, Zinaida Fyodorovna, this is cynicism. You must not be so despairing. Listen to me," I went on, catching at a thought which flashed dimly upon me, and which seemed to me might still save us both. "Listen, I have passed through so many experiences in my time that my head goes round at the thought of them, and I have realised with my mind, with my racked soul, that man finds his true destiny in nothing if not in self-sacrificing love for his neighbour. It is towards that we must strive, and that is our destination. That is my faith." I wanted to go on to speak of mercy, of forgiveness, but there was an insincere note in my voice, and I was embarrassed. "I want to live," I said genuinely. "To live, to live. I want peace, tranquillity, I want warmth, this sea here, to have you near. Oh, how I wish I could rouse in you the same thirst for life! You spoke just now of love, but it would be enough for me to have you near, to hear your voice, to watch the look in your face." She flushed crimson, and to hinder my speaking said quickly: "You love life and I hate it, so our ways lie apart." She poured herself out some tea, but did not touch it, went into the bedroom and lay down. "I imagine it is better to cut short this conversation," she said to me from within. "Everything is over for me and I want nothing. What more is there to say?" "No, it's not all over." "Oh, very well. I know. I am sick of it. That's enough." I got up, took a turn from one end of the room to the other, and went out into the corridor. When late at night I went to her door and listened, I distinctly heard her crying. Next morning the waiter, handing me my clothes, informed me with a smile that the lady in number 13 was confined. I dressed somehow, and almost fainting with terror, ran to Zinaida Fyodorovna. In her room I found a doctor, a midwife, and an elderly Russian lady from Harkov, called Darya Mihailovna. There was a smell of ether. I had scarcely crossed the threshold when from the room where she was lying I heard a low, plaintive moan, and, as though it had been wafted me by the wind from Russia, I thought of Orlov, his irony, Polya, the Neva, the drifting snow, then the cab without an apron, the prediction I had read in the cold morning sky, and the despairing cry, "Nina, Nina!" "Go in to her," said the lady. I went in to see Zinaida Fyodorovna, feeling as though I were the father of the child. She was lying with her eyes closed, looking thin and pale, wearing a white cap edged with lace. I remember there were two expressions on her face: one cold, indifferent, apathetic; the other a look of childish helplessness given her by the white cap. She did not hear me come in, or heard perhaps, but did not pay attention. I stood, looked at her, and waited. But her face was contorted with pain. She opened her eyes and gazed at the ceiling as though wondering what was happening to her. There was a look of loathing on her face. "It's horrible," she whispered. "Zinaida Fyodorovna!" I spoke her name softly. She looked at me indifferently, listlessly, and closed her eyes. I stood there a little while, then went away. At night Darya Mihailovna informed me that the child, a girl, was born, but that the mother was in a dangerous condition. Then I heard noise and bustle in the passage. Darya Mihailovna came to me again, and with a face of despair, wringing her hands, said: "Oh, this is awful! The doctor suspects that she has taken poison. Oh, how badly Russians do behave here!" And at 12 o'clock the next day Zinaida Fyodorovna died. End of chapter 17. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 18 of An Anonymous Story by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 18. 2 years had passed. Circumstances had changed. I had come to Petersburg again and could live here openly. I was no longer afraid of being and seeming sentimental, and gave myself up entirely to the fatherly, or rather idolatrous, feeling roused in me by Sonia, Zinaida Fyodorovna's child. I fed her with my own hands, gave her her bath, put her to bed, never took my eyes off her for nights together, and screamed when it seemed to me that the nurse was just going to drop her. My thirst for normal, ordinary life became stronger and more acute as time went on, but wider vision stopped short at Sonia, as though I had found in her at last just what I needed. I loved the child madly. In her I saw the continuation of my life, and it was not exactly that I fancied, but I felt, I almost believed, that when I had cast off at last my long, bony, bearded frame, I should go on living in those little blue eyes, that silky, flaxen hair, those dimpled pink hands which stroked my face so lovingly and were clasped round my neck. Sonia's future made me anxious. Orlov was her father. In her birth certificate she was called Krasnovsky. And the only person who knew of her existence and took interest in her, that is, I, was at death's door. I had to think about her seriously. The day after I arrived in Petersburg I went to see Orlov. The door was opened to me by a stout old fellow with red whiskers and no moustache, who looked like a German. Polya, who was tidying the drawing room, did not recognize me, but Orlov knew me at once. "Ah, Mr. Revolutionist," he said, looking at me with curiosity and laughing. "What fate has brought you?" He was not changed in the least: the same well-groomed, unpleasant face, the same irony. And a new book was lying on the table just as of old, with an ivory paper knife thrust in it. He had evidently been reading before I came in. He made me sit down, offered me a cigar, and, with a delicacy only found in well-bred people, concealing the unpleasant feeling aroused by my face and my wasted figure, observed casually that I was not in the least changed, and that he would have known me anywhere in spite of my having grown a beard. We talked of the weather, of Paris. To dispose as quickly as possible of the oppressive, inevitable question which weighed upon him and me, he asked: "Zinaida Fyodorovna is dead?" "Yes," I answered. "In childbirth?" "Yes, in childbirth. The doctor suspected another cause of death, but it is more comforting for you and for me to think that she died in childbirth." He sighed decorously and was silent. The angel of silence passed over us, as they say. "Yes, and here everything is as it used to be, no changes," he said briskly, seeing that I was looking about the room. "My father, as you know, has left the service and is living in retirement. I am still in the same department. Do you remember Pekarsky? He is just the same as ever. Gruzin died of diphtheria a year ago. Kukushkin is alive and often speaks of you. By the way," said Orlov, dropping his eyes with an air of reserve, "when Kukushkin heard who you were, he began telling every one you had attacked him and tried to murder him, and that he only just escaped with his life." I did not speak. "Old servants do not forget their masters. It's very nice of you," said Orlov jocosely. "Will you have some wine and some coffee, though? I will tell them to make some." "No, thank you. I have come to see you about a very important matter, Georgy Ivanitch." "I am not fond of important matters, but I shall be glad to be of service to you. What do you want?" "You see," I began, growing agitated, "I have here with me Zinaida Fyodorovna's daughter. Hitherto I have brought her up, but, as you see, before many days I shall be an empty sound. I should like to die with the thought that she is provided for." Orlov coloured a little, frowned a little, and took a cursory and sullen glance at me. He was unpleasantly affected, not so much by the important matter as by my words about death, about becoming an empty sound. "Yes, it must be thought about," he said, screening his eyes as though from the sun. "Thank you. You say it's a girl?" "Yes, a girl, a wonderful child." "Oh, yes, of course, it's not a lap dog, but a human being. I understand we must consider it seriously. I am prepared to do my part, and am very grateful to you." He got up, walked about, biting his nails, and stopped before a picture. "We must think about it," he said in a hollow voice, standing with his back to me. "I shall go to Pekarsky's to day, and will ask him to go to Krasnovsky's. I don't think he will make much ado about consenting to take the child." "But, excuse me, I don't see what Krasnovsky has got to do with it," I said, also getting up and walking to a picture at the other end of the room. "But she bears his name, of course," said Orlov. "Yes, he may be legally obliged to accept the child I don't know. But I came to you, Georgy Ivanitch, not to discuss the legal aspect." "Yes, yes, you are right," he agreed briskly. "I believe I am talking nonsense. But don't excite yourself. We will decide the matter to our mutual satisfaction. If one thing won't do, we'll try another, and if that won't do, we'll try a third. One way or another, this delicate question shall be settled. Pekarsky will arrange it all. Be so good as to leave me your address, and I will let you know at once what we decide. Where are you living?" Orlov wrote down my address, sighed, and said with a smile, "Oh, Lord, what a job it is to be the father of a little daughter! But Pekarsky will arrange it all. He is a sensible man. Did you stay long in Paris?" "2 months." We were silent. Orlov was evidently afraid I should begin talking of the child again, and to turn my attention in another direction, said, "You have probably forgotten your letter by now. But I have kept it. I understand your mood at the time, and I must own I respect that letter. 'Damnable cold blood,' 'Asiatic,' 'coarse laugh' that was charming and characteristic," he went on with an ironical smile. "And the fundamental thought is perhaps near the truth, though one might dispute the question endlessly. That is," he hesitated, "not dispute the thought itself, but your attitude to the question, your temperament, so to say. Yes, my life is abnormal, corrupted, of no use to any one, and what prevents me from beginning a new life is cowardice. There you are quite right. But that you take it so much to heart, are troubled and reduced to despair by it, that's irrational. There you are quite wrong. A living man cannot help being troubled and reduced to despair when he sees that he himself is going to ruin, and others are going to ruin round him." "Who doubts it? I am not advocating indifference. All I ask for is an objective attitude to life. The more objective, the less danger of falling into error. One must look into the root of things and try to see in every phenomenon a cause of all the other causes. We have grown feeble, slack, degraded, in fact. Our generation is entirely composed of neurasthenics and whimperers. We do nothing but talk of fatigue and exhaustion. But the fault is neither yours nor mine. We are of too little consequence to affect the destiny of a whole generation. We must suppose for that larger, more general causes with a solid raison d'être from the biological point of view. We are neurasthenics, flabby, renegades, but perhaps it's necessary and of service for generations that will come after us. Not one hair falls from the head without the will of the Heavenly Father. In other words, nothing happens by chance in nature and in human environment. Everything has its cause and is inevitable. And if so, why should we worry and write despairing letters?" "It's all very well," I said, thinking a little. "I believe it will be easier and clearer for the generations to come, our experience will be at their service. But one wants to live apart from future generations, and not only for their sake. Life is only given us once, and one wants to live it boldly, with full consciousness and beauty. One wants to play a striking, independent, noble part. One wants to make history so that those generations may not have the right to say of each of us that we were nonentities or worse. I believe what is going on about us is inevitable and not without a purpose, but what have I to do with that inevitability? Why should my ego be lost? "Well, there's no help for it," sighed Orlov, getting up, and, as it were, giving me to understand that our conversation was over. I took my hat. "We've only been sitting here half an hour, and how many questions we have settled, when you come to think of it," said Orlov, seeing me into the hall. "So I will see to that matter. I will see Pekarsky to day. Don't be uneasy." He stood waiting while I put on my coat, and was obviously relieved at the feeling that I was going away. "Georgy Ivanitch, give me back my letter," I said. "Certainly." He went to his study, and a minute later returned with the letter. I thanked him and went away. The next day I got a letter from him. He congratulated me on the satisfactory settlement of the question. Pekarsky knew a lady, who wrote, who kept a school something like a kindergarten where she took quite little children. The lady could be entirely depended upon, but before concluding anything with her, it would be as well to discuss the matter with Krasnovsky. It was a matter of form. He advised me to see Pekarsky at once and to take the birth certificate with me, if I had it. Rest assured of the sincere respect and devotion of your humble servant. I read this letter, and Sonia sat on the table and gazed at me attentively without blinking, as though she knew her fate was being decided. End of chapter 18. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. End of an anonymous story by Anton Chekhov, translated by Constance Garnett, 1861 to 1946.